They said the wind in Sagebrush Flats carried secrets, and on that late autumn afternoon, it pushed every whisper straight into Clara Whitfield's ears. She held one hand to the small of her back and the other against the swell of her belly as she stepped out of the livery stable, dust swirling around her boots like a warning she couldn't afford to heed. The town looked bleached by sun and worry.
He's a hermit with
false
a temper.
fronts of the mercantile and the
snake,
saloon paling against a sky as wide as a promise or a lie. She'd been knocking on doors for 2 days and had earned exactly 3 nickels, a blister, and a handful of advice that tasted like pity. At the general store, a fly buzzed lazy circles under the porch roof, while a sign tacked to a cedar post snagged her eye. The letters were thick and sure, brushed by a steady hand. Help wanted, cook and housekeeper room provided, Elias Boone, Dry Mesa Ranch. Her mouth went dry. Room provided meant a roof, and a roof meant she could carry this baby into winter with at least a chance. She read the sign twice more, as if an extra look might conjure up a better option. Nothing did. Wouldn't. The voice came from the rocker by the window, where Mrs. Ada McKee knitted without looking up. Her needles clicked, neat and certain. Man wrote that notice is better left alone. Clara squared her shoulders. Is he cruel? Cruel's a word folks in town don't earn the right to use, Ada said, finally lifting her eyes. We sit close. We talk big. Mr. Boone sits far. He says nothing. Some people confuse distance with danger. From the counter, Mr. Henley the shopkeeper snorted through his mustache. Boone's a hermit with a temper, lost a brother to the war and his wife to a fever, stays out by Dry Mesa like a wolf with a thorn in its paw. No ranch hands last more than a month out there. I don't have a month, Clara said, keeping her voice even. I have a week's worth of oats and a pair of boots I'm still paying for. I can cook. I can scrub. I can keep to myself. A man in a sweat-salted hat, some drifter with tobacco stains on his lip, leaned from the Cracker Barrel. You're Whitfield, ain't you? Heard the name around. Folks say, Clara set her jaw. Folks say too much. Her late husband's name fit her like a borrowed coat. Necessary, ill-fitting, and full of someone else's history. She had married the name when she married the man, then buried the man and kept the name because it was the only thing stamped on her papers. But every time someone said Whitfield, it felt like the town glanced past her shoulder, waiting for ghosts. Mr. Henley chewed on his words, then spat them straight. Dry Mesa's 2 hours north by mule cart. Trail's rutted, and there's a wash you cross that turns tricky after a storm. You sure you're up for that in your condition? I don't see another sign that says room provided, she said. I'll take tricky over hungry. Ada's needles paused. You need a hat pin for that bonnet if the wind kicks, and a tin of salve for your ankles. Take them on my tab. Clara startled. Ma'am, Tell me no if it makes you feel proud, Ada said, but don't tell me no if it makes you hungry. Clara nodded, throat tight. She bought a small sack of flour on credit she didn't own and stepped into the noon glare with the sign's letters stamped behind her eyes. The mule, short as a grudge and twice as stubborn, pulled the rented cart along Sagebrush Road while a dust devil danced to their left, swirling grit up to the bluff. The prairie lay out like a faded quilt, stubble grass, thorn brush, and those lonely cottonwoods tracing a dry creek bed toward the mesas. Half a mile out, a cowboy on a paint horse drew alongside. He was young, grin easy, the kind of man who waved to the horizon like it waved back. Ma'am, you headed for Dry Mesa? Yes, she said, not slowing. He tipped his hat. Name's Jed Rourke. I ride fence for the Hart place, south of there. Boone's land abuts ours, if abutting counts when a man won't step to the line. You sure you want to knock on his door? Well, he's Boone." "What does that mean?" she asked. Jed looked toward the mesa, eyes narrowing. "Means he keeps to himself and won't take lip. Means he doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, and doesn't ask for help. Means there's a story there and nobody's brave enough or kind enough to earn it." He shifted in the saddle. "Watch the wash up ahead. The bottom looks dry, but it cradles wheel ruts like traps. Ease the mule to the left, where the gravel's lighter." "Thank you," she said. He rode another 20 yards with her. "If you get turned around or need a hand, Hart Ranch light stays on most nights. Sheriff Hart's my uncle. He's stubborn in a useful direction." Clara smiled despite herself. "I'll keep that in mind." The wash was exactly the kind of trouble Jed promised it'd be. The cartwheel slid into a deep rut and lodged like a coin in a slot. The mule sensed her frustration and planted its hooves out of spite. Clara braced her boots in the gravel, pressed her shoulder to the cart rail, and heaved. The wheel refused, then grudgingly rolled, clacking free just as the mule tossed its head. "Move," she said, breathless. The mule didn't, until she picked up a length of mesquite and thumped the ground near its shoulder. "Move!" The cart lurched forward. She caught herself, palm scraping the rough rail, and hissed between her teeth. A little blood beaded, bright as berries. She wiped it on her skirt and kept going. The mesa rose ahead, red stone stacked like a giant's bookshelf. A fence line ran crooked toward a cluster of buildings hunkered against the wind. A long, low ranch house with a roof of corrugated tin, a barn, a shed, a bunkhouse gone gray with weather, and a windmill squeaking in a slow circle. No dogs barked, no smoke curled. The place had the stillness of a held breath. Clara swung down from the cart, tied the mule to the hitching post, and smoothed her skirt. She had the sudden thought that if she looked ragged enough, whoever lived here might see her as a problem. But if she looked too proud, they might see her as a challenge. She settled for honest. Chin up, hands steady, breath even. The door opened before she could knock. He stood framed in the dim, tall, shoulders like a barn beam, a day's beard shadowing a jaw that looked carved. His eyes were the first surprise, clear gray, steady as a winter pond. He took her in without hurry. The belly she carried, the scuffed boots, the stubborn set to her mouth she hadn't meant to wear. "I'm here about the notice," she said. "Cook and housekeeper." His hand stayed on the door, as if he had to remind it not to close. "Name?" "Clara Whitfield." He froze. It wasn't a large motion, no step back, no sharp flinch, but it told on him just the same. The hand on the door tightened, knuckles whitening. The winter pond eyes went deeper. "Whitfield," he said, voice gone low. "Your husband?" "Passed," she said. "Months back. I kept his name because the cat scratched off mine on the papers and I couldn't afford a new set." She forced a small breath. "If that's a problem, I'll turn around." The silence between them stretched, thin as glass. Somewhere out by the windmill, a chain clinked, a delicate sound in the open. He stepped back from the door. "It's not a problem," he said, though it arrived like he'd dragged the words uphill. "I'm Elias Boone. You can come in." The house smelled like old coffee and saddle soap. A stove hunched in the corner as if embarrassed by its own empty belly. A long table sat under a window where the light broke on dust. He kept a neat space, boots lined by the door, a folded blanket on a chair, a rifle on pegs above the mantel, oiled and quiet. "I can pay $15 a month," Elias said. "Rooms in the bunkhouse if I can make it tight against the weather. Chores are cooking, washing, tending hens, keeping the stove warm. I'll see to the cattle and the fence. We don't have company." "I can cook from scratch," she said. "I can stretch flour if I have to, and make coffee too strong for men who talk too much." Something at the corner of his mouth threatened to be a smile, and then thought better of it. "You'll eat what you make too. I don't believe in separate tables." "Good," she said. "I don't believe in separate anything that keeps food from people who need it." He nodded once. "You're welcome to stay if you can stand the quiet." "Quiet's where a woman can hear herself think," she said, then caught the edge of a memory and swallowed. "I could use a little of that." He walked to the mantel and laid his fingers along the rifle's stock like a man checking a pulse. "One thing," he said. "Whitfield is a name I know. My brother married that name once, a long time ago. We didn't part on good terms." A beat of air, careful. "I won't hold his sins against you." "You don't even know them," she said, helpless to the laugh that rose and faded. "But I appreciate the courtesy." The wind picked up and threw a handful of dust at the window. The bunkhouse door banged once, then scraped shut. Elias's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back. He was a man whose attention moved on rails. Slow, precise, no extra noise. "Come see the bunkhouse," he said. "I've got half the roof patched, and I can set a stove in by nightfall if I don't lose a finger." They stepped back onto the porch. The horizon had the color of tarnished silver, the sun softening behind a gauze of cloud. She followed him along the hard-packed path, feeling the land's magnitude press around them, emptiness like a test or an invitation. By the henhouse, a rooster strutted with the insane certainty of kings. The bunkhouse door stuck halfway. Elias set his shoulder to it, and it gave with a groan, letting out a breath of cool, wood-smelling air. "It's not much," he said, "but it's dry." "It's a start," she said, palm on the doorframe. Splinter pressing her skin like proof she was still here. "I can make it warm." He nodded. "That would be welcome." They were both reaching for the same small kindness and didn't know how to meet in the middle of it. Outside, the windmill clicked. Far off, something yipped, coyotes testing the edge of evening. In the doorway's dim, Clara felt the fragile balance of a new life tilt toward possibility. From the ridge beyond the north fence, a rider crested and paused, a dark shape against the smudged sky. He sat his horse a long moment, watching the ranch with the stillness of a decision growing. Clara didn't see him. Elias did, a shadow moving in the flat of his eye, and his jaw set hard enough to speak for him. "Tomorrow," he said, voice steady. "I'll drive you into town for supplies. Today, you rest. We'll make a list." "Thank you," she said. She wanted to say more, to speak of fear that wore her like a second dress, of hope that fit better but seemed more expensive. Instead, she tightened the ribbon at her collar and smiled because she could. "I'll start with coffee." "Coffee sounds right," he said, and his hand loosened from the doorframe at last. Somewhere behind his eyes, a colder season stirred, tied to a name that matched the one on her papers. He closed the door against the rising wind, and for the first time in a long while, the house remembered what it felt like to expect a second cup. The mornings on Dry Mesa Ranch began before the sun had a chance to touch the tin roof. Clara woke to the groan of the windmill turning in the dark and the muffled sound of Elias moving around in the main house. Her first day had ended with a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, but now there was no time to linger. She pulled on her boots, feeling the ache in her calves from the long ride yesterday, and stepped out into the chill. The air smelled of dust and sage, the kind of scent that told you winter was on its way. A row of chickens clucked impatiently in their coop, their beady eyes fixed on her as if she'd been late for weeks. "All right," she murmured, scattering feed from the sack slung over her shoulder. The rooster strutted up, gave her a glare like a foreman, then stalked off to oversee his hens. The bunkhouse was plain but dry. Elias had left a small crate by the door. Hammer, nails, a patched blanket. As if to say he was making good on his word, to fix the place without having to say much at all. She noticed the roof over her cot was tighter than when she'd first arrived, the gaps filled with fresh boards. He must have worked after she'd gone to sleep. Breakfast was a test of her memory and skill. She fried eggs in an iron skillet so heavy it took both hands to lift, warmed biscuits from a fresh batch, and brewed coffee with a pinch of salt to take the edge off. Elias came in from the yard, coat dusted with frost, and nodded toward the table without taking off his hat. "You'll want to use the shallow well for drinking water," he said between bites. "The deep one's sweeter, but the rope frays. I'll mend it when I can." "I can patch rope," she said. His eyes flicked up, weighing the truth in her voice. "It's a haul from the far pasture." "I can walk." She kept her tone even, letting him know she wasn't made of glass. After breakfast, she scrubbed the pans and set them to dry, then followed the trail to the well. The mule was tied nearby, chewing on what looked like the same tuft of grass it had been working yesterday. "You and I will get along," she told it, lowering the bucket into the dark shaft. The pulley squealed, the rope coarse under her hands. When the bucket broke the surface, cold water sloshed over her knuckles. She carried it back, step by steady step, her breath fogging in the cold. By midday, she'd hauled 2 more buckets, swept the kitchen, and started a pot of stew simmering on the stove. Outside, the wind came in restless gusts, rattling the barn door until she propped it with a stone. She caught sight of Elias by the corral, running a hand down the flank of a skittish bay. He moved like a man who knew when to be quiet, every gesture measured. When the horse finally stilled, he glanced toward her, just a glance, but enough to acknowledge her presence before turning back to his work. They kept mostly to themselves that first week. He repaired the bunkhouse roof and patched a gap in the chicken coop. She learned which drawer held the spare lantern oil and which fence posts were loose enough to worry about. Some evenings they ate in near silence, the only sound the wind sighing through the stovepipe. But there were moments, small, almost accidental, when the air between them shifted. One afternoon, she was hauling a sack of feed when the mule jerked its head and the rope snapped from her hand. She stumbled back, catching herself on the fence post. Before she could chase it, Elias appeared, calm as stone, and caught the lead rope mid-swing. He tied it off and handed it back. "You pull from the knot, not the tail," he said. "Less slack to yank out of your grip." She nodded, a little breathless. "Thank you." That night she found a length of leather reins hanging on the bunkhouse door. No note, just the reins, oiled and ready. She smiled to herself, understanding that on this ranch, that was his way of speaking. The isolation was stark, but not unfriendly. At night, coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls stretching across the prairie like questions with no answers. In the mornings, the frost edged every blade of grass in silver. Clara found herself listening for Elias's boots on the porch, a sign the day had started. She caught him once, lingering in the doorway of the bunkhouse with a hammer in hand, as if deciding whether to knock. He didn't, just set the hammer on the step and walked away. By the end of the second week, the respect between them had settled into something steady. He stopped asking if she could manage the chores, and she stopped bracing for him to question her work. There was no friendship yet, not the easy kind, but there was the beginnings of trust. The kind forged quietly when two people recognized the same kind of loss in each other. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the mesa, she ladled stew into bowls and set them on the table. He sat across from her, hat off for once, hair flattened where it had been pressed. "Winter's early this year," he said. "We'll need more firewood stacked." "I can split kindling," she replied. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. "We'll see." Outside, the wind carried the first bite of snow. Inside, the stove glowed warm, and for the first time since she'd buried her husband, Clara felt the faint shape of something she hadn't dared hope for. The sense that maybe in this vast and empty land, she could belong. The storm rolled in without warning. Clara had been hanging a line of laundry between the bunkhouse and the barn, the sun still sharp enough to make her squint when the wind shifted. It wasn't just a breeze. It was a wall of air, heavy with the smell of rain and something metallic that made her skin prickle. She looked toward the mesa and saw it, a thick bruise of clouds boiling up from the horizon, swallowing the blue as it came. "Leave it," Elias called from the corral, his voice raised over the rising gusts. He was untying the skittish bay horse, leading it into the barn with steady hands. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before it breaks." Clara dropped the damp shirt in her hands and hurried to gather what she could, her skirts whipping around her legs. She'd seen prairie storms before, but there was a weight to this one, a kind of pressing silence between the gusts that made her heart beat faster. By the time she reached the bunkhouse, the first raindrops smacked against her face, cold and heavy, like they'd fallen from miles up. Then the sky tore open. Rain came in sheets, pounding the roof, turning the yard into a churn of mud and water. The wind howled through every crack in the buildings, rattling shutters and slamming doors. She lit the lanterns and checked the windows, pressing the old frames tight against the wind. In the main house, Elias was doing the same, his hair plastered to his forehead, his coat dripping. "Creek'll rise fast," he said, glancing toward the east pasture. "Best we stay put." The hours blurred in the noise of the storm. Lightning forked over the mesa, illuminating the world in harsh, colorless light. Thunder followed, so close it rattled the dishes in the cupboard. Clara tried to busy herself, peeling potatoes for supper, but her hands wouldn't steady. Something deep inside her was tightening, a low, insistent ache in her back that spread to her belly. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves, just the weather. But when she bent to set the pot on the stove, a sharp wave of pain bent her in half. She gripped the edge of the table until it passed, her breath shallow. Elias noticed. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Clara?" "It's fine," she said quickly, though the words sounded thin. "Just, the baby's restless." Another wave hit, harder, deeper. She braced both hands on the table, unable to speak through it. When it eased, she saw Elias's face change. He wasn't a man who startled easy, but now there was something in his expression. Alert, calculating. "It's starting, isn't it?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I thought maybe it was too soon, but..." Her voice cracked. partly from pain, partly from fear. The rain pounded harder, a steady roar on the roof. Elias moved quickly, setting the lantern on the table, pulling the oilcloth from the cupboard, and laying it over the bed in the spare room. "No way to get to town," he said, more to himself than her. "Road'll be washed out by now." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the quilt beneath her as another contraction rolled through. "There's no doctor." "I've seen it done," he said, meeting her eyes with a steadiness she clung to. "You just tell me what you need, and I'll do it." The storm became a backdrop to their strange, urgent rhythm. He boiled water on the stove, fetched every clean cloth in the house, stoked the fire until the room was warm enough for the baby. Between contractions, she gave him instructions: how to hold her, how to listen for the change in her breathing. He listened like every word mattered. The hours stretched long. The lantern's glow turned the walls gold, shadows flickering as the wind pressed and moaned outside. Clara's world narrowed to waves of pain, the solid presence of Elias's hands steadying her, the sound of his voice when he told her to breathe. When the baby finally came, it was in a rush, a cry sharp and defiant against the storm. Elias held her with a kind of awe, his large hands cradling something impossibly small. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough. Clara leaned back against the pillows, tears mixing with the sweat on her face. "Let me see her." He placed the baby in her arms, and Clara felt her heart split open in a way she hadn't thought possible since loss had made it so guarded. The tiny face, scrunched and red, the fists waving. This was hers. "Lila," she whispered. "Her name is Lila." Elias nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "Lila Boone Whitfield," he said quietly, like it was a promise. The rain began to ease, the thunder rolling farther away. They sat in the warm, lamplight room, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and new life. Elias pulled a chair close, not quite touching, but near enough that Clara could feel his presence. "You saved us both," she said after a while. "You did the hard work," he replied. But there was something in his gaze, a fierce, protective light, that told her he'd claimed both her and the child in some unspoken way. Outside, the creek swelled high, the road a river of mud. Inside, the storm had passed, leaving a quiet so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. For the first time since she'd stepped off the wagon in Sagebrush Flats, Clara felt safe. And she knew, no matter what came next, this ranch, this man, and the wind-scoured land around them had become part of her story now. The days after Lila's birth passed in a strange kind of stillness. The air outside carried the sharp scent of wet earth and cedar, the creek still swollen from the storm. Inside, Clara moved slowly, her body sore but her hands always busy, swaddling the baby, rocking her in the quiet hours before dawn, brewing coffee for Elias when he came in from checking the fence line. Elias had taken to glancing toward the bunkhouse more often, his gray eyes resting on the door, as if making sure it was still there, still whole. He wasn't a man who spoke much, but when he did, it was plain and without waste. "I'll ride to town for supplies tomorrow," he said one morning over breakfast. "We'll need more lamp oil, sugar, and cloth for Lila." Clara smiled at the sound of her daughter's name in his voice. "And maybe more coffee if you mean to keep drinking it like water." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I'll see what I can do." For a while, life fell into a rhythm. Clara tended the chickens, simmered stews that filled the kitchen with warmth, and learned the peculiar creaks of the ranch house, the sigh of the wind through the stovepipe, The groan of the porch boards when Elias came in at dusk. Nights were quiet except for coyotes singing somewhere beyond the fence line. But quiet never lasted long on the frontier. It began with a rider on the horizon. Clara saw him first through the kitchen window, a dark figure against the pale sweep of afternoon sky. He didn't hurry, just kept coming. The slow, deliberate gait of a man who wasn't worried about being stopped. By the time Elias came in from the barn, the rider was close enough that Clara could make out the set of his shoulders, broad, stiff, like someone bracing for a fight. Elias's jaw tightened. "Stay inside," he said, already moving toward the door. The rider drew up in the yard, dust rising around the hooves of his horse. 2 more men followed, hanging back a few paces. The lead man swung down, boots hitting the ground with a thud. He was taller than she expected, with a scar cutting through the stubble on his jaw and eyes so pale they almost looked washed out. "Afternoon, Boone," the man said, voice slow, drawl thick enough to cut with a knife. "Pike," Elias replied flatly. The name caught in Clara's throat. Vernon Pike. She hadn't heard it in months, not since the night she thought she'd been freed from him for good. Her stomach turned cold. "You've been busy," Vernon said, his gaze sliding past Elias to the window where Clara stood. He smiled, and it was the same smile she remembered, sharp, cold, without warmth. "Hello, Clara." She stepped back from the window, heart pounding. Elias moved forward, blocking Vernon's view. "State your business." Vernon's smile widened. "My business is standing right behind you. She's my wife, Boone, and I hear she's had a baby. My baby." "That child isn't yours," Elias said, voice like stone. "The law might see it different," Vernon drawled. "Ain't no divorce papers. Ain't no proof otherwise." He stepped closer, boots grinding in the dirt. "I'm here to take back what's mine." Elias didn't move. "You're leaving." "Not without her." The 2 men stood facing each other, the air between them tight as a drawn rope. Behind Vernon, the 2 riders shifted in their saddles, hands near their gun belts. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. She could see Vernon's hand resting casually near his hip, the glint of metal under his coat. Elias's voice stayed calm, but there was iron in it. "You come back here again, Pike, and you'll regret it. This ranch isn't open ground for the likes of you." Vernon tilted his head, studying him. "You always did have a hero streak, Boone. That'll get you killed one day." He looked toward the bunkhouse again, his pale eyes lingering too long. But maybe not today. He turned, mounted his horse in one smooth motion, and jerked his head for the others to follow. As they rode off, Vernon called over his shoulder, "Don't get too comfortable, Clara. I'll be back for what's mine." The dust from their horses hung in the air long after they disappeared over the rise. Inside, Clara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "I thought he was dead." Elias shut the door, his expression unreadable. "Men like that don't die easy." She sank into the chair, every muscle trembling. "He won't stop." "I know," Elias said. He crouched so his eyes met hers. "But he won't take you. Or the baby." Something in the way he said it, low, steady, without room for doubt, settled the panic clawing at her chest. But fear still coiled tight in her stomach. She knew Vernon. He'd come back. And when he did, he wouldn't come alone. That night, the wind rose again, rattling the windows like impatient hands. Clara lay awake, Lila sleeping in the crook of her arm, listening for hoofbeats in the dark. Somewhere outside, Elias moved through the yard. The faint crunch of his boots on the hard ground a reminder that someone was keeping watch, for now, at least. The first hint of trouble came before the sun broke the horizon. Clara had been dozing in the bunkhouse, Lila bundled in a quilt beside her, when a faint vibration in the floorboards pulled her from sleep. It wasn't the wind. This was rhythmic, heavier. Hoofbeats, many of them. She swung her legs over the cot and pulled on her boots, heart pounding. Through the frost-blurred window, she saw them, dark shapes moving against the paling sky, the glint of gunmetal in the half-light. Vernon Pike was at the front, his pale eyes catching what little dawn there was. Elias was already outside. He stood in the yard with his rifle in hand, coat collar turned up against the morning cold. Clara could see the steam of his breath, slow and even, as he watched the riders close in. "Stay inside," he called toward the bunkhouse without looking away from the approaching men. Her first instinct was to argue, but one glance at Lila's sleeping face stopped her. She wrapped the baby tighter and crouched by the bed, forcing herself to breathe evenly. The hoofbeats grew louder, kicking up dust even in the cold morning air. Vernon reined up just outside rifle range, his gang fanning out behind him, 6 men, all rough and hungry-looking. Their horses shifted, snorting, tails swishing in the tense air. "Morning, Boone," Vernon called, grinning like this was some neighborly visit. "I told you I'd be back." "You're trespassing," Elias said. His voice was flat, controlled, but Clara could hear the steel under it. "I'm here for my wife and child. You got about half a minute to hand 'em over." "They're not yours," Elias said. Vernon's grin sharpened. "Then I reckon the law should sort it out. Only problem is, law's a long way from here, and I got all the persuasion I need right here." He patted the butt of his revolver. One of the men to his left chuckled, another spat into the dirt. They were coiled tight, waiting for a signal. Elias's stance didn't change, but his eyes swept the group, noting their positions. "You ride away now, Pike, and you can still see another sunrise. Push this, and the ground's gonna drink deep before breakfast." Vernon tilted his head like he was considering it, then snapped his hand down. The first shot cracked the air, followed by the deafening staccato of gunfire. Clara ducked instinctively, clutching Lila close as splinters leapt from the doorframe. The sharp tang of gunpowder drifted in with the cold. Elias moved like a man who'd been here before. He fired from cover by the porch post, each shot deliberate, forcing Vernon's men to scatter for whatever cover they could find. A bullet sparked off the water trough. Another punched a hole clean through the barn door. From the ridge to the south came a new sound, shouts, hoofbeats, and the hard crack of more gunfire. Sheriff Caleb Hart and his posse burst into view, rifles at the ready. The gang's confidence faltered, some wheeling their horses toward open ground. Vernon swore, returning fire toward the new arrivals. Elias took the opening and advanced a few steps, his rifle steady against his shoulder. One of Vernon's men tumbled from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. The posse swept in, their numbers and position turning the tide fast. 2 of the gang dropped their guns and raised their hands. Another tried to run and was brought down by a shot from Caleb himself. Vernon saw the noose tightening. He locked eyes with Elias across the churned-up yard, a look that wasn't fear so much as a promise. Then he yanked his horse's head around and bolted, spurring hard for the northern trail. "Let him go," Caleb barked when one of his men aimed to shoot. "We'll take the ones we've got." Within minutes, the yard was littered with disarmed men, their hands bound, the posse standing watch. The air still smelled of gunpowder, the echo of shots fading into the cold morning. Clara stepped out onto the porch, Lila against her chest. Her eyes went to Elias first. He was unhurt, but the tension in his shoulders hadn't eased. "He'll come back," she said quietly. Elias nodded once, not taking his eyes off the trail Vernon had taken. "Yeah. And next time he won't be so loud about it." Caleb walked up, tipping his hat to Clara. "Ma'am, you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her hands still shook. "Thanks to you." "Boone here had it handled," Caleb said. Then to Elias, "We'll take these boys to Sagebrush. Keep an ear out. If Pike heads back this way, I'll know." When the posse rode out with the prisoners, the ranch felt too quiet, the stillness almost heavy. Clara looked at the churned dirt in the yard, the splintered boards, the faint smear of blood near the trough. Elias finally lowered his rifle and met her gaze. "You should get inside. It's cold." She didn't move. "You saved us." His jaw flexed. "I told you. He's not taking you. Or the baby." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an understanding forged under fire. The danger wasn't over, not by a long stretch, but now she knew, without question, that when trouble came again, Elias Boone would stand his ground. And so would she. The stagecoach rattled into Sagebrush Flats under a high, brittle sky, the kind that made the air taste like dust and old tin. Elias had gone into town for fence wire and lamp oil, not company. But when the coach door swung open and a tall, lean man stepped down, Elias froze. The man was maybe 30, sunburned deep, with a week's worth of travel grit on his coat. He carried himself with the loose, easy sway of someone who'd spent years chasing horizons, yet there was a tension under it, coiled tight. "Uncle," the man said, a crooked smile breaking through the weariness. Elias's stomach dropped. Thomas Boone. The nephew he'd thought dead for more than a decade, swallowed by some nameless frontier grave, or so the family had believed. Seeing him now was like looking at a ghost who'd picked up a few bad habits along the way. "I was passing through Red Bluff. Heard a fella say you still had land out here." Thomas glanced down the street, taking in the faded storefronts. "Figured I'd see if blood still counts for something." Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes searched Thomas's face, reading every crease and shadow for the truth. "You hungry?" Thomas grinned wider. "Always." By the time they reached Dry Mesa Ranch, the sun was slipping toward the mesa, painting the red rock in copper and gold. Clara was outside, hanging a small blanket on the line. She looked up at the sound of hooves, her hand stilling on the clothespin. "This is Thomas," Elias said as they dismounted. "My brother's boy." Clara's surprise softened quickly into a welcoming smile. "You've been on the trail a long time." "Long enough to miss home cooking," Thomas said with a nod toward the house. That night, Clara made a pot of beans with salt pork, cornbread crisp at the edges. Thomas ate like a man making up for lost time, telling half-stories about mining camps in the Rockies, odd jobs in river towns, and poker games that went sideways fast. His voice carried the rhythm of someone who'd learned to keep a room's attention, but every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the window or the door, like he was keeping track of the exits. Elias listened without comment, his face unreadable. Clara noticed the way his hands stayed flat on the table, like he was holding something steady inside himself. After supper, she stepped out to check on the chickens. When she came back, Thomas was sitting cross-legged on the floor, Lila in his lap. He was making faces at her, each one rewarded with a tiny coo or blink. "She's got a strong grip," he said, holding up his finger where Lila's tiny hand clung. Clara couldn't help but smile. She gets that from both sides. Later, when Thomas had gone out to the bunkhouse to settle in, Clara found Elias by the stove, poking at the embers. "You didn't expect to see him again," she said quietly. "No," Elias replied. "Last I heard, he'd run off with a trail crew headed north. Word came back that there'd been a fight. Men killed. Folks said he was one of them. And now? Now he's here." Elias's gaze stayed on the fire. "And I don't know what he's bringing with him." The days that followed had an odd rhythm. Thomas pitched in with chores, hauling water, fixing the latch on the barn door, mending a saddle strap. But there was a restless energy in him. Sometimes he'd disappear for an hour or two, coming back with no explanation and dust on his boots. Clara found herself curious about him. He was quick with a joke, kind with Lila, and respectful toward her. But there was something in the way his eyes scanned the horizon, like he was expecting trouble to ride out of it at any moment. One afternoon, she caught him by the corral, leaning on the fence. "You planning to stay long?" she asked. He shrugged. "Depends on the wind. I never meant to stick anywhere too long, but—" He glanced toward the bunkhouse where Lila's quilt was hanging to dry. "Some places feel different." That night, as the wind picked up outside, Elias sat at the table with his ledger open but untouched. "Thomas isn't telling me everything," he said finally. Clara poured him coffee. "You think he's in trouble?" "I think trouble follows him," Elias said. "And trouble has a way of finding this ranch lately." She thought of Vernon Pike, of the promise he'd made before riding off. "Then maybe it's time to be ready for both kinds." Elias looked up at her. And for the first time since Thomas had arrived, there was the faintest glint of something almost like agreement in his eyes. Neither of them knew that somewhere, not far enough away, men were already asking about Thomas Boone. Men who didn't care about family, or new beginnings, or the thin safety Dry Mesa Ranch offered. Men who were coming. The morning May Caldwell rode in. The air had that brittle edge that warned of frost by nightfall. Clara was at the chicken coop, scattering feed, when she spotted a lone rider cresting the rise from the east. The woman sat tall in the saddle, her coat a deep brown oilskin, hat brim pulled low. Even at a distance, she carried herself with purpose. Elias was mending fence near the barn, and when he looked up, his expression sharpened. He didn't know her, but he knew the type. Folks who came that far out didn't come for casual conversation. May dismounted in a single fluid motion. She tied her mare to the hitch post, patted its neck, and turned toward Clara. Her gaze was steady, direct. "You Clara Whitfield?" Clara brushed her hands on her apron. "I am." May nodded once. "Name's May Caldwell. I've been riding near a week to find you." Elias had crossed the yard by then, his presence solid at Clara's side. "What for?" May's eyes flicked to him, weighing whether to speak. "Private matter. Concerns her late husband." Clara felt the old ache of that name like a stone in her chest. "You knew Matthew?" "Knew of him," May said. "And I knew some of the men he ran with." Elias's jaw tightened. "You might as well say it plain." May reached into her coat and pulled out a small oilskin packet tied with string. "He wasn't the man you thought, Mrs. Whitfield. He was in on robberies, stage lines, payroll runs. Not just once, more than a few times." Clara's breath caught. "That's not possible. Matthew—" She shook her head, but the certainty she wanted wasn't there. "I've got letters," May said, holding out the packet. "Written in his own hand. Plans, names, amounts. The last one talks about a stash. Money they lifted off a bank wagon headed for Carson City. They hid it, but before they could fetch it, the law got close. Your husband was keeping the location quiet, even from his partners. Elias didn't take the letters, but his eyes stayed on May. And why bring this to her? May's voice was even, but her gaze never left Clara. Because two of those partners think she knows where the money is. They're not the sort to ask politely. I wanted to warn her before they find her. Clara felt the cold settle in her bones, sharper than the autumn air. I don't know anything about stolen money. That won't matter to them, May said. They believe what they believe, and belief can be dangerous. Elias finally took the packet, untied it, and scanned the top letter. His brow furrowed, then smoothed into something harder. These men. What do you know about them? One's named Dent Rooker. Mean, patient, and he likes to work in the dark. The other's Joe Hale. Talks too much, but he's quick with a gun. Last I heard, they were in Red Bluff asking after you. Thomas appeared then, leaning against the porch post. He'd clearly heard most of it, his eyes fixed on May. And you just happened to be close enough to ride out here and warn us? May looked at him without flinching. I was looking for her. Your uncle just happens to be the man she works for. Clara hugged her arms around herself. Why help me? You don't even know me. May's face softened, just barely. Because once I was where you are, and no one warned me. She adjusted her hat, glancing toward her mare. I can't stay. Folks will notice I'm gone too long, but you need to be ready. These men don't give up easy. Elias nodded once. We'll be ready. May gave him a look that said she hoped he meant it. Then she swung into the saddle and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the still air. When she was gone, Elias handed Clara the packet. Read them or don't, but keep them safe. Clara didn't open them, not yet. The weight of them in her hands felt heavier than paper should. If what she says is true, then I've been living under a lie. Elias's voice was low. It's still your life. Doesn't change who you are now. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the packet. Those men she mentioned, Rooker and Hale, they're worse than she let on. If they're looking for you, we've got trouble coming from more than one trail. Clara met Elias's gaze. You think Vernon Pike would team up with them? Elias's silence was answer enough. That night, after the lamps were blown out, Clara sat at the table in the dim light from the stove, the packet of letters in front of her. She untied the string, unfolded the first sheet, and read her husband's handwriting. Familiar, but somehow foreign now. Every line was a nail in the coffin of the man she'd thought she'd married. When the wind rattled the shutters, she startled, her hand moving to where Lila slept in a basket beside her. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a target, and the ranch, for all its distance from the rest of the world, suddenly didn't feel far enough away. The telegram arrived in the gray stillness of early morning, delivered by a breathless boy from Sagebrush Flats, who'd ridden half the night to get there. Elias met him at the gate, took the folded slip without a word, and pressed a silver coin into his palm before sending him on his way. Clara was in the kitchen, pouring coffee when Elias stepped in. He laid the telegram on the table. The paper was damp from his hand, the ink slightly smudged. Pike Brothers asking after Thomas. Red Bluff. Mean talk in saloon. Watch your back. Hart Thomas, leaning in the doorway with a half-buttoned shirt, read it once, and let out a low whistle. That'd be Eli and Owen Pike. Vernon's kin. Mean enough on their own. Worse together. Elias didn't look at him. His gaze stayed on the telegram. Why would they be hunting you? Thomas hesitated just long enough for Clara to notice. I might have seen something they didn't want seen. Years back, in Dakota Territory. A card game went bad. A man ended up face down in the street. I was the only one sober enough to remember who pulled the trigger. They never liked that I lived to tell about it. Elias folded the telegram once, slow and deliberate. So now they're coming to settle an old score. And they'll ride with Vernon if it suits them, Clara said quietly. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Clara could see Elias's mind working, measuring distances, counting bullets, mapping the land in his head. We're not waiting for them to knock on the door, he said finally. Thomas straightened. What are you thinking? The canyon's north of here, Elias said. Narrow enough that they'll have to come single file. High ground on both sides. If they're coming for you, we let them think they've got you cornered, then turn it on them. Clara frowned. That sounds like walking into trouble on purpose. It's better than letting it walk in here, Elias said. This ranch isn't built to hold off that many men for long. Out there, the land does half the work for us. Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh. I'm guessing you already know who you want riding with you. Jed Rourke, Elias said. He knows those canyons like his own pocket. And he's meaner than both Pikes before breakfast. Within the hour, Elias was saddling the bay, his movements quick but not rushed. Clara met him at the barn door, her hands wrapped around a bundle, bread, jerky, and a tin of coffee grounds. You'll need these, she said. He took the bundle, his hand brushing hers. Lock the doors. Keep the rifle loaded. She nodded, but her stomach was tight. You come back. I plan to, he said, and for the first time that morning. His mouth almost softened into a smile. By mid-afternoon, Elias and Thomas were riding hard toward the North Canyon, Jed Rourke meeting them at the base of a bluff. Jed was a tall, raw-boned man with a scar down one cheek and eyes the color of smoke. Heard you've got varmints sniffing around, he said, swinging into line with them. Figured it'd be a waste of good daylight not to run 'em into a hole. The canyon they chose was a slit in the earth, walls rising steep and jagged on both sides. From the rim, a man could see for miles. From the bottom, you were blind to anything but the strip of sky overhead. Elias and Jed picked their spots high above the trail, rifles within easy reach. Thomas would ride just ahead of the choke point, bait to draw the outlaws in. As the sun dipped low, the wind funneled through the rock, carrying every sound. The distant rhythm of hooves came first, steady, unhurried, confident. Voices followed, bouncing off the canyon walls. Trail's getting narrow, a man called. That's the point, another replied. Elias lay prone behind a jut of stone, eyes steady through the rifle sight. The first rider came into view, broad-shouldered, face shadowed under his hat brim. Behind him, another, then another. He counted 8 in all. Vernon Pike near the middle, the 2 brothers close behind. Thomas glanced back once, just enough for Elias to see the signal. Then he urged his horse forward, letting the distance between him and the gang stretch just enough. When the lead rider reached the choke point, Elias fired. The shot cracked through the canyon like lightning, dropping the man clean out of the saddle. Chaos followed, shouts, horses rearing, gunfire flashing in the dimming light. Jed's rifle barked from the opposite rim, each shot deliberate, herding the gang into the worst of the trap. Vernon's voice rose above the din. "Spread out! Find 'em!" But there was nowhere to spread, only rock and the narrow trail. Elias shifted his aim, keeping the pikes pinned, while Thomas wheeled his horse into a shallow cut in the wall, firing as he went. It was working. The gang was tangled, their horses skittish, their cover thin. But Elias knew it wasn't over, not while Vernon was still upright and shouting. And Vernon was shouting, his pale eyes scanning the rim like he could burn holes through the rock to get at Elias. The fight wasn't done. Not yet. The canyon turned into a throat of thunder. Elias worked the bolt, sighted, fired. The shot cracked off the stone like a thrown plate. Below, horses screamed and tried to climb air, iron shoes skidding on shale. Jed answered from the opposite rim, calm as rain, each report from his long rifle punching another hole in the gang's nerve. "Get high! Get high!" Vernon Pike shouted, hauling his gelding sideways as chips of rock stung his cheek. He looked smaller from above, but his voice still carried that cold certainty Clara remembered. A man who believed the world owed him its neck. Thomas darted ahead through the kink in the trail, just far enough to promise a catch, not far enough to lose the teeth of the trap. He fired left-handed into the scramble behind him, the muzzle flash blanching his jaw. Elias slid to a new notch, shoulders pressed to cold sandstone. He counted quickly, 8 riders at first sight. One was down, tangled in a stirrup. Another scrambled for cover behind a broom of juniper that didn't deserve the name. That left 6 fighting, the 2 Pike brothers, Vernon, Dent Rooker with his lank hair and dead-light eyes, Joe Hale with a grin too big for the moment, and 2 boys who'd never learned the difference between a bluff and a wall. "Rim, 2 o'clock," Jed called across the chasm, voice flat, not quite a shout. Elias peered over the lip. One of the boys had dismounted, scrabbling up a goat path carved by rain and luck. Elias took the breath it takes to steady the hands and sent the shot, knocking loose both man and bad decision. The kid slid on his stomach, then grabbed a root and wept into his sleeve, gun lost somewhere in the slide. "Throw the hands where I can see 'em," Elias called. The boy did it without waiting for the echo to come back. Rooker put 3 fast rounds into the stone an arm's length from Elias's ear. Dust stung his eyes. Elias rolled, feeling grit grind into his palm, and belly crawled to the shadow of a shelf the size of a door. He could hear the Pikes below, talking over one another, Eli slow and mean, Owen brittle and eager. Vernon cut through both with that pale patience. "Press him left," Vernon snapped. "Hale with me. Rooker, hold that high ground. We're going up." Elias's mouth went dry. Up meant the shoulder of the rim, a scramble of loose rock and mesquite ladders. If they took even a sliver of it, they could flank Jed and collapse the whole angle. He glanced across. Jed had already moved to counter, silhouette low, hat brim a clean line against the sky. Thomas swung his horse into the shallow cut, bait turned thorn. He snapped off 2 shots and saw Hale's hat jump, then disappear behind a boulder. Eli Pike hauled on a lariat like he meant to fish Thomas out of the ditch. The loop flew, wide and ugly. Thomas ducked and the rope snagged a dead limb. He spurred, using the tug to sling himself deeper into cover, and laughed once. Short, more air than humor. "Company," Jed said, and grunted. Elias's stomach dropped. He saw it. Owen Pike had found the spine of a crack that ran up from the trail to Jed's ledge and was swarming through it like a cat with bad intentions. Jed stepped to meet him, knife already out, long and bright. The first clash was all elbows and breath, a scrape of boots on stone. Owen jabbed upward with a revolver as if it were a punch. Jed twisted, took the barrel on his forearm, and hammered the boy's wrist against rock until the gun kissed air. The knife flashed. Owen yowled and reeled. Jed's next strike was a backhand that sent him sprawling into the notch he'd crawled up. "Stay put," Jed said, not winded. Owen stayed. Rooker rose from behind a rock and tried to drill Jed for the trouble. Elias put a bullet into the juniper branch an inch from Rooker's cheek. Green exploded, and needles filled the air like thrown pins. Rooker ducked and swore in a voice that had too much calm in it. Elias moved again. The canyon was a chessboard, and every square bit at the heels. "Boone!" Vernon's shout floated up, too smooth. "You ain't a mountain. You got to come down sometime." A shot followed the words, then another, then the magpie chatter of Hale's cheap pistol. Elias didn't answer. Talking was for men who wanted to hear themselves or to borrow courage. He sighted on Eli Pike instead. Caught him while he was squinting over the lariat tangle and put a round through the rim of the man's hat, just enough to crease hair and pride. Eli threw himself flat with a howl and crawled under his horse. The horse, offended, bolted without him. "Enough!" Vernon said, low, like a man choosing one card from a deck. He spurred straight for the goat path, up into the teeth of the flank. He didn't care who shot. His body believed in itself. Elias understood it suddenly, why men followed Vernon. It wasn't just fear. It was the way he made gravity look optional. Elias broke cover and ran the rim, boots finding holds he wouldn't have bet on, lungs burning with cold stone air. He dropped prone where the path came near enough to reach with a long shadow. "Jed!" he called. Jed saw it the same instant and swung to cover the bottom, pinning Rooker and Hale with two quick shots that sent sparks from rock and curses from the men behind it. Vernon came up like a promise. For a heartbeat, there was no distance between them. Just close air and the smell of sweat and iron and a cedar crushed under a boot. Vernon's pistol was in his hand, cocked, but Elias's barrel was already inside the arc. He batted the gun toward emptiness. The shot went wild, carving a bright, invisible line through sky. Vernon smiled without humor, mouth pulling tight. He let go of the pistol the way you drop a lie and drew a knife from behind his belt. It was a mean thing, narrow and sharp. The kind of blade a man picks when he enjoys the work. Elias didn't step back. "You don't quit," he said. "Never learned how," Vernon said, and lunged. The first cut whistled air from Elias's coat. He pivoted, grabbed Vernon's wrist, and slammed it into stone. Bone thudded against sandstone. The knife wobbled and bit the rim, showering grit. Vernon went low, shoulder to Elias's gut, and drove him back 2 steps toward emptiness. The world dropped away behind Elias's heels, the canyon floor far below, the trail a thread. He hooked Vernon's ankle with his boot and twisted. They crashed sideways into the scrub. Thorns found both of them without prejudice. They broke apart and rose in the same breath. Vernon fainted high. Elias didn't take the bait. He waited half a heartbeat longer than comfort, then punched the point of his own blade, not as pretty as Vernon's but honest, into the meat of Vernon's forearm. Blood blossomed. Vernon hissed and struck with his left. The knife scraped along Elias's ribs, hot and wet. Elias grunted, anger a clean line that steadied his hands. He hammered the pommel into Vernon's jaw. The man's head snapped. His pale eyes went thin with something like surprise. Below, chaos continued. Hale yelling he was hit, Rooker gone quiet, a horse screaming in a key too high for a man to hear without flinching. Thomas's rifle cracked twice in short succession. "Rooker down!" he shouted, voice echoing. "Hale's runnin'!" Elias didn't have space to celebrate. Vernon came again, fast and low, trying to take a kidney and the argument with it. Elias spun off his line and met him with shoulder and hip, wrestling now, knives forgotten for a breath. They hit the rim guardrail of scrub hard enough to tear it up by the roots. Sand gave. The world leaned. Vernon's hand found Elias's collar and heaved. Elias felt his boots skid, soles scraping for a purchase that wasn't there. He let the momentum carry him 2 inches farther than sense, enough to set the hook, and then dropped, rolling his weight under Vernon's center. He shoved, not backward but across, angling the man's stride into air. For a heartbeat that tried to be longer, Vernon stood with nothing under him but the idea of land. His eyes, a washed-out blue now lit from inside with recognition, met Elias's. If there was anything human in them, it didn't ask forgiveness. It made a tally. "You don't get to keep what's not yours," Elias said, voice quiet. Vernon fell. It wasn't a tumble so much as a vanishing, a slide of coat and limbs and knife, a scatter of shale like thrown coins, a thud that arrived late and final. Dust rose from the ravine floor in a ring. Silence came after, sudden and heavy, as if the canyon itself had exhaled. Elias stood very still until his balance came back and his ribs stopped screaming. He looked down long enough to be sure the story was finished. It was. Across the rim, Jed swore softly at the sting of a furrow on his bicep and then grinned like he'd been promised a better evening than he'd expected. "Hale lit out south with his tail on fire," he called. "Rooker's breathing, but I don't think he's keen on standing any time soon. The kid's up here praying. The other 2 dropped guns. I can keep 'em that way." Thomas rode up slow, hat in hand, eyes on the space where Vernon had been. Some of the swagger had gone out of him. Something older had stepped in. "It done?" he asked. "It's done," Elias said. They moved then, the way men do after the danger's past but the work isn't. Jed roped the compliant and grim. Thomas scrambled down enough to put irons on Rooker and stanch the man's shoulder with a strip torn from his own shirt. Elias wrapped his ribs, at Jed's insistence, with a binding that made every breath useful again. By the time the sun pushed a last pale hand over the mesa, 4 men were tied and sullen. One was sobbing and swearing he'd go straight, and the canyon had given back every echo it was willing to share. They made a slow train toward Sagebrush Flats. Jed riding point, the prisoners strung like bad ideas between good ones, Thomas keeping the rear. Elias lagged one ridge long enough to look back. Wind skated over the rim and tugged at his coat. A hawk circled where the air was easiest. Down in the blue shade, dust still hung over the place where a man had learned the cost of taking. Elias tipped his hat, not in respect, but in acknowledgement. The land kept its own ledger. They came into town with the light stretched thin. Sheriff Caleb Hart met them in the street, eyes taking in the story without needing all the words. "Boone," he said, "you look stepped on." "Felt worse," Elias answered. "Pike's done. The brothers scattered. Rooker's yours. Hale might run until his horse forgets his name." Caleb nodded once, the deep kind, the kind that makes history official. "I'll telegraph Red Bluff and Carson City. Folks'll sleep easier tonight." He looked past Elias toward the road west. "You going home?" "Yeah," Elias said, and felt the word land where it needed to. "There's someone there who needs to hear it's finished." He rode for Dry Mesa under a sky that had washed itself clean. Every bump in the trail found his ribs and made a note, but the ache was a good language. On the ridge above the ranch, he saw the lamp in the kitchen window, Clara's light. It was small in the big dark, and it was enough. When he swung down in the yard, Clara was already on the porch, Lila warm against her heart. She saw the bandage, the dust, the way he held himself, and her breath hitched. He nodded once, tired and sure. "It's over," he said. She closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them shining. "Then we begin," she said. Behind them, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like a page turning. Ahead, there were fences to put back, letters to answer, and a map that might end in a town called Silver Creek. But for a long moment, there was only the door and the light inside, and the knowledge that some debts had been paid in full. The first snow came early that year, a soft, dry fall that dusted the mesa like sifted flour. By mid-morning, the corrals were edged in white, and the cottonwoods along the creek stood bare, their black branches etched against a pewter sky. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house, Lila bundled in her arms, watching the wind send tiny spirals across the yard. It had been 3 weeks since the canyon fight. 3 weeks since Vernon Pike's shadow had lifted from Dry Mesa, since Rooker had been taken away in irons, since the worst of the danger had passed. But the land remembered. The bullet scars in the barn door, the patched fence by the wash, even the way Elias scanned the horizon a little longer than he used to. Reminders that peace here was never a given, only earned. Inside, the warmth from the stove carried the smell of coffee and bread. Thomas was at the table mending a bridle strap with a bent needle. He glanced up when Clara stepped in. "Snow this early means a long winter," he said, half to himself. "Or a hard one," she replied. Elias came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots. "Hard's not new. We've done hard before." Clara caught the way his gaze lingered on her, on Lila, before moving to the travel-worn map spread on the table. He'd been looking at it almost every evening now, tracing the route west with a finger. She laid Lila in her cradle, pulled off her gloves, and joined him. "Still thinking about it?" "Thinking," he said, voice low. "Silver Creek's good country. Not too big, not too small. Plenty of grazing, a mercantile that stays stocked year-round, and folks who don't ask more questions than they have to." Thomas looked up. "You'd sell this place?" Elias's eyes traveled around the room. The rough-hewn beams, the worn table, the stove he'd rebuilt himself. Dry Mesa served its time, but it's too far from help, and I'm done waiting for trouble to find us. Silver Creek's got a schoolhouse. Lila deserves that. Clara felt a warmth that wasn't from the stove. The thought of a place where Lila could grow without the sound of gunfire in the night was almost too much to let herself imagine. But she also knew leaving meant closing a chapter written in hard ink. That afternoon, Elias rode into Sagebrush Flats to speak with Sheriff Hart about a buyer for the ranch. Clara spent the hours packing the first of their things, linens, Lila's clothes, the small keepsakes she'd carried from her old life. She found the oilskin packet May Caldwell had given her, still tied with string. After a long moment, she tucked it deep in the bottom of a crate. The past could ride its own trail now. By the time Elias returned, the snow had stopped and the sky had cleared to a deep, sharp blue. He stepped inside with a faint smile. Hart knows a rancher over near Red Willow who's looking to expand. He'll ride out in a few days to see the place. 3 days later, the deal was struck. The buyer came with a firm handshake, a wagon load of fence posts, and a promise to keep the place running. Clara watched from the porch as Elias signed the paper on the tailgate of the man's wagon. His hand was steady, but she could see the weight of it in the set of his shoulders. That night, the three of them, 4 counting Lila, sat at the table with plates of roast chicken and cornbread. It was the last supper they'd eat in that kitchen. They didn't speak much. There was too much to say and no easy way to say it. The morning they left, the sun rose clean over the mesa, turning the snow to a wash of pale gold. Elias hitched the wagon while Thomas loaded the last of the crates. Clara walked through the house one final time. In the quiet rooms, she could almost hear the echoes, the slam of the front door on a windy day, the creak of Elias's boots across the floor, the soft cry of Lila's first night. When she stepped outside, Elias was waiting by the wagon. "Ready?" She nodded. They climbed aboard, Elias on the reins, Clara beside him with Lila in her arms, Thomas riding his bay behind the wagon. The wheels crunched over the snow as they rolled out of the yard. Clara didn't look back until they reached the ridge above the ranch. From there, the buildings were small, tucked against the mesa like they'd always been part of it. "It's a good place," she said softly. Elias nodded. It was. And now it's someone else's turn. The road to Silver Creek wound west, through low hills and stands of pine, past frozen streams that glimmered under the winter sun. They stopped at midday to water the horses and eat bread with cold slices of ham. Thomas told a story about a riverboat cook who could skin a rabbit faster than most men could draw a gun, and for the first time in weeks, Clara laughed without feeling like it might catch in her throat. By the second day, the mountains rose on the horizon, their peaks capped in white. The air grew sharper, cleaner. At night, they camped under a sky so crowded with stars, it looked like the heavens had spilled silver dust across it. Lila slept bundled between them, the fire crackling low. On the morning of the third day, they crested a ridge and saw it. Silver Creek, nestled in a wide valley, the sunlight catching the water that wound through it. Smoke curled from chimneys, and a small church bell was ringing somewhere in the heart of town. Beyond it, pasture land stretched green even under the touch of winter. Elias drew the team to a stop, the wagon wheels crunching in the frosted grass. "Looks like a good place to start over," he said. Clara took in the sight, the creek, the houses, the promise of a schoolhouse for Lila, and felt something in her chest ease. It does. They rolled into town as the morning trade was starting, shopkeepers sweeping snow from their stoops, children darting between wagons. A few townsfolk looked up, curious but not unfriendly. Elias guided the wagon toward a small house on the edge of town, the one Hart's friend had written about in his letter, a tidy place with a barn out back and a stretch of pasture that caught the morning light. When they climbed down, Clara stood for a long moment, Lila warm in her arms, the air smelling of wood smoke and the clean rush of the creek. Elias came to stand beside her. "Welcome home," he said. For the first time in years, the word felt true. She turned to him, a smile slow and certain. "Home," she repeated. And as the wind moved softly through the valley, Clara knew that family wasn't the name on your papers or the blood in your veins. It was the people who stood with you through every hard mile and the place you built together at the end of it.